Welcome to the next in our series of online lectures for Western Civ 2. Today we are talking about World War II and the fight for Western civilization. As always, there are some key terms and some key questions that you should be able to answer by the time this lecture is finished. So, with that said, let's get to it. These are the death tolls from World War II in Europe. Now, if you look at those numbers, they seem roughly on par with World War I. Remember, in World War I, there were about 20 million battlefield deaths, and about 21 million more people were wounded in the conflict. Here, in World War II, you've got battle deaths in Europe of about 15 million, and those wounded about 25 million. They're appallingly high numbers, but at the same time, they are about the same of what we saw in World War I. Here is where things are different, however. The number of civilian deaths in World War II was huge compared to any other war in history. This is due to a number of factors. The Holocaust was one major factor. The Holocaust, which means the burning, was the direct targeting of civilians, specifically Jews, the mentally and physically handicapped, homosexuals, and others deemed inferior by the Nazis. These numbers will give you some idea of how many people died in the Holocaust in addition to the Jewish populations. Now you'll notice that not everyone here is Jewish. In fact, large numbers of Russians, Serbians, and other groups also died in this conflict. That's going to have something to do with Germany's racial theories and how they see certain peoples as inferior or superior to others. But anyway, let's continue on with this. But the Holocaust only accounts for some of the civilian casualties. During World War II, civilians were directly targeted by enemy forces. This was made possible through the creation of deadly new technology, specifically the airplane. The airplane meant that each side's military could directly attack civilian populations en masse. The Germans made good use of these new weapons. In the Battle of Britain, the Germans attempted to force Great Britain to surrender by using a massive bombing campaign against the civilians of London. About 40,000 civilians were killed. The Allies also targeted civilian populations, however. A massive bombing campaign against the German city of Dresden may have killed about 135,000 civilians. One of the worst bombing campaigns of the war occurred in 1945 when the U.S. used firebombs against Tokyo. The resulting damage was worse than either Hiroshima or Nagasaki, and resulted in the deaths of about 100,000 people. Now, many of those who survived the initial bombing were also left homeless, leaving them vulnerable to death following the attack. Here you can see the damage as firefighters battle a blaze set by bombers during Germany's bombing of London. This is an aerial photo that illustrates the damage done by the firebombing of Tokyo. The point I'm trying to make here is that World War II was different from previous wars. It was different in the Nazis' systematic efforts to exterminate a significant portion of the population of Europe, and it was also different because it took total war and the targeting of civilians to a whole new level. There was no longer a distinction between soldiers fighting on the battlefield and civilians living on the home front. All were now considered to be legitimate targets. So, how did this happen? How did World War II begin? Well, let's go back to this concept that was introduced in an earlier lecture. The idea of Lebensraum was first introduced by Adolf Hitler in the 1920s. The word simply means living space, and by it Hitler meant that if Germany was to grow and thrive, it needed more territory. This territory could be used to provide natural resources like coal, iron, and oil to Germany's factories. The farmland also could be used to feed the nation's growing population. So where was Germany to find all of this living space? Eastern Europe. Hitler argued that Germany could expand eastward into the nations of Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the Soviet Union. He justified doing this by claiming that the peoples of this region, specifically Russians and Ukrainians, Poles and Czechs, were inferior to Germans. These peoples would be either put to work for the Germans as slaves, or they would be exterminated. Now, the process by which Hitler went about finding Lebensraum for Germany was a quick one to some extent. His first target was Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia was a new nation that had been created after World War I, out of territory formerly controlled by Austria-Hungary. Within the borders of Czechoslovakia, there lived thousands of ethnic Germans. Most of these Germans were concentrated in territories near the German border. This area was known as the Sudetenland, and Hitler demanded that Czechoslovakia turn over this territory to Germany. The Sudetenland is located right about here. It's this sort of striped region along the borders of Germany. Now, this created a crisis in Europe. Great Britain and France were allies of Czechoslovakia. Now, the great powers, Great Britain, France, and Germany, will meet in Munich at the Munich Conference in 1938 to try to resolve this crisis. Interestingly, Czechoslovakia was not invited to participate in the conference. Thus, it is no surprise that Britain and France will prove willing to compromise with Hitler. In what was known as a policy of appeasement, Britain and France sought to avoid another European war by giving Hitler what he wanted. They were trying to appease him. The Sudetenland was turned over to Germany. Czechoslovakia had no say in the matter. Not everyone believed that appeasing Hitler was the best thing to do. Winston Churchill blasted the Munich Agreement on the floor of Parliament, saying, quote, "I think you will find that in a period of time, which may be measured in years, but may be measured by only months, Czechoslovakia will be engulfed in the Nazi regime." He's correct. In March of 1939, Nazi troops will invade the rest of Czechoslovakia. The new nation will cease to exist as an independent state. Yet Hitler wasn't finished with Lebensraum. He continued to push eastward in September of 1939, when he launched a full-scale invasion of Poland. Poland was another new nation that had been established by the Treaty of Versailles after World War I. The invasion featured the new German military machine, complete with air power and tanks. Now, typically, the invasion of Poland is seen as the beginning of World War II in Europe. So that is how we date the beginning of the war, is Hitler's invasion of Poland. Now, as I said, the German military machine now featured modern air power and modern tanks, and the Polish army was quickly overwhelmed by what the Germans termed their Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. Now, unlike Czechoslovakia, this time the other great powers will be willing to act. They will be willing to go to war to protect Poland. Britain and France will come to Poland's defense by declaring war on Germany. Another world war was now inevitable. Not that it really matters, because in the spring of 1940, Hitler will launch a major offensive against Britain and against French forces in the West. Like the Poles, the Allies will be quickly overwhelmed by Germany's new modern military. In just 6 weeks, France will be forced to surrender, leaving only Great Britain to carry on the fight. Great Britain wasn't alone for long, however. In June of 1941, the Germans launched a massive invasion of Russia. Again, Russia was seen as Lebensraum for Germany. Russian people were considered to be inferior. So were the Ukrainians, who also lived within Russia. These peoples were considered to be inferior, and so therefore Germany's expansion into Russia was thought to be justified. Now, at first, the German forces were incredibly successful, pushing thousands of miles into the Russian interior and approaching the gates of Moscow itself. Eventually, however, the Germans will fall victim to the same problems that faced Napoleon when he invaded Russia in 1812. The Russian winter was brutal, and Russia's resources were vast. The German advance was slowed and finally stopped in a series of grand battles. One of the worst of these battles was the Battle of Stalingrad, where 1.1 million Russians died. Let me repeat that. 1.1 million Russian soldiers will die at the Battle of Stalingrad. More than 800,000 Germans and their allies will be killed in this battle as well. This is a massive battle, a massive attack, and it leads to a German defeat. The Battle of Stalingrad and, in fact, the Russia's ability to stop the German advance in the east is seen as one of the turning points in World War II. Another turning point in the war will occur in the west. Once the United States will become involved in World War II, I should say this, the United States will become involved in World War II following the Pearl Harbor attack in December of 1941. Still, it's going to be a slow process before the United States and its ally, Great Britain, will be able to really start to push back against the Germans in the West. In fact, it's going to take 2.5 years before the U.S. and British forces will feel strong enough to open a second front in Western Europe. This rollback of German conquest began on June 6, 1944, when Allies will successfully launch the D-Day invasion of German-held France. More than 4,000 Allied soldiers lost their lives in that invasion. Moreover, this was only the beginning of the end. Germany would fight on for another year. How the war came to a close, however, is a story for another lecture.